dialogue or confrontation? In today's world, disputes over maritime boundaries and territorial sovereignty remain widespread. The United Nations Charter encourages all member states to resolve their differences using peaceful means such as negotiations or consultations, but in practice, it's not always the case. It's often not the case. Why is that? Why some countries prefer to refer to the book of confrontation instead of that of dialogue? What are the consequences of confrontational approaches when it comes to the seas that are connecting us in East Asia, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth? And what can we do? How can we sail together smoothly across the whirlpool of security dilemma that threaten to engulf us all? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to part one of a special two-part series on settlement of maritime disputes, dialogue or confrontation. We are here in the beautiful seaside resort of Sanya in southern China's Hainan province. The program is jointly organized by the Huayang Center for Maritime Cooperation and Ocean Governance, the China Oceanic Development Foundation, the National Institute for South China Sea Studies of China, Hainan Institute for Free Trade Port Studies, and CGTN. I'm Li Xin. It's indeed a great honor. And I'm even more honored to have 7 distinguished panelists sitting next to me. Let me introduce them to you. Starting from my immediate left, Yoon Suk-Joon, Chairman of Huayang Research Center for Maritime Cooperation and Ocean Governance and Chairman of the Academic Committee at China's National Institute for South China Sea Studies. Welcome, Mr. Wu. Phillip Saunders, Dean Emeritus and Adjunct Professor of Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University in Canada. O.A. Sun, Principal Advisor at the Pacific Research Center of Malaysia. Welcome. Navy Captain Yoon Suk-Joon, Senior Fellow at the Korea Institute for Military Affairs and a retired Navy Captain of the Republic of Korea Navy. Welcome. Yan, Director of the Research Center for Oceans Law and Policy at the National Institute for South China Sea Studies. Welcome. Romel Banlawi, President of the Philippine Society for International Security Studies. Good to have you on the show. And last but not least, Ambassador Yi Shen-liang, Visiting Professor at Chengdu University of Technology and former Ambassador of China to Norway. And we're also pleased to have all of you on site. Let's give ourselves a warm round of applause. So during part one of this program, we'll hear from each speaker to make an opening statement on their take, on their thoughts and suggestions concerning how do we promote dialogue and avoid confrontation in trying to settle disputes in the waters connecting us. Let's start with Mr. Yoon Suk-Joon, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Liu Xin. I will strictly follow your requirement, manage well the time. Actually, I'm going to focus my talking on the South China Sea issue and then how to promote cooperation between China and United States in the South China Sea region. Then how to look at the current South China Sea situation, I would like to summarize that as 3 aspects. One, generally speaking, South China Sea now is relatively stable and manageable, but if we don't manage it well, there will be big challenges. Where and how? One is the intensified militarization, spearheaded by the United States, followed by U.S. allies and partners in this region. If we look at the bilateral or trilateral or multilateral security mechanisms in the South China region or beyond, all of those are targeted or designed for China. Second one is unilateral actions in the South China region by United States. If we look at unilateral oil and gas exploitation in disputed area, land expansion or land reclamation, or try to consolidate their control over the islands or reefs, you might agree with my judgment. unilateralism is another challenge. The third one is detrimental impact of the 2016 arbitration ruling. All those unilateral actions conducted by climate states, majority of those activities are endorsed by the arbitration ruling. So in this sense, the arbitration ruling, or the word of tribunal, is the troublemaker of peace and stability of the South China Sea, and the troublemaker of the bilateral relations, China and the Philippines, and then how to promote maritime cooperation between China and the countries in this region, particularly between China and the Columbia states. Very short remarks. China and the littoral countries in the South China region, particularly the Columbia states, should promote our maritime cooperation under the DOC. What DOC says? Under the framework of DOC, environmental protection, marine scientific research, search and rescue in the South China region, and the safety of the maritime navigation. So those areas are possible for China and Columbia States to promote cooperation. We should start from small, bilateral, long-term initiatives. For instance, joint fishery survey in the South China region. Is it possible? It's possible because it is less sensitive, it's easy to start, and it's easy to bring benefits to all participants. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wu. Thank you. And thank you very much for respecting the time limit. I was really fascinated about what you were saying, unilateralism as the main source of problem. For instance, 2016 ruling by the so-called arbitral tribunal in The Hague, and where can we start to build trust? But let's move on to our next speaker before we expand on these points. Professor Phillip Saunders, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to preface these quite brief remarks by acknowledging an important limitation. I'm going to speak not so much to the South China Sea dispute, which is part of this, but to that notion of a subset of dispute settlement, which is adjudication, binding adjudication, whether in a court or tribunal, whether entirely ad hoc or through some process defined in prior agreements, such as the Law of the Sea Convention. These may be compulsory, but even then, they are through an advance consent, and international law works that way. States consent to be adjudicated. We don't get that benefit in domestic law. But they may consent through the treaties in advance, but on conditions that they feel will protect their interests over time. So the ones that are most problematic are what I might call contested compulsory jurisdiction, like South China Sea arbitration, where an arbitral or other tribunal proceeds under an advance consent, but one party believes that it is not operating within its proper jurisdiction. Now, it's obvious to most, and fortunately our host has taken away about 3 seconds of the time I need on the UN Charter and its dispute resolution options. But it's important to remember that there are much broader dispute settlement options that operate every day. The minority of dispute settlement occurs through adjudication. Peaceful means, including negotiation, including as simple as an agreement to disagree. Now, my hometown in Canada is a few kilometers away from a remaining boundary and sovereignty dispute we have with the United States of America, an island in which we have disagreed over the ownership since the American Revolution. We're right. The problem with that is not a problem. We just continue the disagreement. We've been on the same side in most conflicts since. That is an agreement to disagree, and we manage to dispute. But to say that not all dispute settlement is by adjudication would add to that one important qualification. Not all adjudications are dispute settlement. The adjudication doesn't necessarily constitute the settlement of a dispute for a number of reasons. Resources and management, resources and territorial disputes and the relationships that they involve have to be managed both before and after a tribunal reaches a decision on the part of a dispute that is within its jurisdiction to settle. It's very rare that a tribunal could actually settle by judicial decree all of the aspects of a dispute. So that implies that the decision to litigate is a policy choice. What aspects of the dispute have been identified as resoluble by adjudication, and where binding adjudication is unlikely to deliver a settlement to the underlying dispute, as I think was the case to some degree in the South China Sea arbitration, then seeking compulsory procedures should be considered confrontation by other means, not necessarily dispute settlement as such.
Thank you so much. Very interesting points. The keywords, advance consent, for instance, an agreement to disagree between US and Canada, and ambitious tribunals. Maybe we get to these points later. Mr. O, from the Southeast Asian regional countries' perspective.
Well, of course, I think nowadays most of us would prefer dialogue instead of confrontation in terms of settlement or disagreements over maritime or territorial disputes. But I think from the Southeast Asian perspective, I would venture to propose that typically among Southeast Asian countries, we have a very established, shall we say, model for settlement or at least dialogues on this sort of disputes. Typically, we will start with whenever there's a territorial or maritime dispute, the participants, the various disputing countries, they will have let's say a round of arguments, sometimes very public arguments, voicing out their concerns, their positions, and so on. And very often that is, of course, for domestic consumption, for domestic political advantages, and so on. But that is important because then you sort of, in a sense, release the valve a little bit and not accumulate a lot of tensions, emotional tensions, which could later on jeopardize the bilateral relations. So after this, typically a few weeks of sort of venting and voicing out your positions and so on, typically the senior officials or the senior politicians of these disputing countries, they would perhaps meet up, they would sit down to, well, engage in dialogues, engage in negotiations, or in general engage in talks. And then later on, after such dialogues, typically there would be one of three outcomes. Number one, it would be, for example, well, they do reach some bilateral agreements or settlements. Number two, sometimes if we cannot reach bilateral agreements, then we submit for international, well, adjudication or, well, sometimes arbitration. And then if we still cannot reach such outcomes, then, well, we will set aside for further considerations in the future until such disputes occur again. So this process, I think, maintain the harmony and sometimes even, as I said, profitability among all the ASEAN countries or Southeast Asian countries. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. But both Malaysia and Indonesia agreed when they went to court over those issues, right? Navy Captain Yoon, it's your time for the opening statement.
Thank you, moderator. The topic I would like to discuss is military neutrality between naval operation and the law enforcement. Because military activity in the disputed waters, especially in South China Sea, is one of the intractable issues to mitigating dialogue rather than to enhancing more physical confrontations. Contentions over the disputed water in East Asia must be understood with two important distinct paradigms, legal and military. In order to preserve a balance between these two, military neutrality should be established. so that the naval operations and law enforcement do not result in physical confrontation. To mitigate such conflict, the naval experts love to suggest the notion of military neutrality, which emphasizes the importance of avoiding the militarization of law enforcement operations. I would like to suggest some benefit of this for the parties, not to mention third parties. The first, military neutrality provides dispute parties and also third parties with a framework of fully considered political, operational, and diplomatic implication of using kinetic means. Second, military neutrality implies commitment to seek a good, reasonable resolution of a dispute and agreed not to involve or extend use of naval and law enforcement. Third, and most importantly, a military neutrality mandates the on-scene commander, operational command, from refrain from use kinetic weapons in disputed waters, where their legality is quite unclear. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Navy Captain Yoon. Thank you. So the central message is very clear: military neutralization. We'll talk more about that during the second part of the program. Next, let's move on to Ms. Yan Yan, your opening statement.
Thank you,
Please.
Chair. Today I want to address three pairs of relations. The first one about the relationship between global order and maritime order, and the second relationship is about maritime dispute settlement and maritime cooperation, and the final relationship about between exclusive maritime interests and inclusive maritime interests. Well, first of all, about global order. The global order that China supports is actually the international system with the UN at its core, and also the international order based on international law, and the basic norms of international relations based on the UN Charter. In terms of the ocean, from Hugo Grotius' Mare Liberum to John Staton's Mare Clausum, the debate on how to utilize ocean resources and how to, what is the principles and rules should be adhered to in claiming maritime rights has never stopped. To me, maritime order is part of the global order, and therefore we should also support the UN standard and international law-based maritime order. And second, about the relationship between maritime dispute settlement and maritime cooperation. The purpose for maritime cooperation is to build mutual trust and confidence among states, especially among coastal states and claimant states, therefore to contribute to the final settlement of the dispute. However, while the dispute settlement takes time, it is often difficult and sometimes extremely difficult to promote and to enhance maritime cooperation. And the reason is actually very simple, because almost every claimant state wants to maximize its own national interest, maritime national interest. Therefore, currently we see not just the South China Sea, but also the whole world's ocean disputes, the traditional maritime disputes over sovereignty and maritime boundary delimitation still the main key causes of conflict and frictions between the states. And finally, what is the solution and what is our way out? I think this is the question of the relationship between exclusive maritime interests and inclusive maritime interests. From the previous speakers, we did hear many suggestions and many proposals on how we can solve maritime dispute, like through dialogue, through negotiation, and also through legal means, and also the role of military in terms of the dispute. We do hear many proposals. And the settlement of maritime disputes sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it takes decades, and sometimes it even takes centuries. So with while the maritime disputes has not been settled for a short time, how we can move on, how we can guarantee the regional peace and stability. To me, it is the question of how we can balance exclusive maritime rights and inclusive maritime rights. Well, my personal argument is that maritime security can be and should be viewed as an inclusive interest given the common interest in combating the verified maritime security threats, for example, piracy, terrorism, environmental damage, etc., etc. And this is why back in the year 2019, China proposed the idea of MCSF, Maritime Community with a Shared Future. As I already mentioned in the opening about global order, for maritime order, we also need to adhere to international system with the UN as core and international order based on international law. And also, we need to bear in mind that the ocean is the shared heritage of mankind. Therefore, we need to bear in mind the concept of MCSF. And I think personally that is our way out. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yin Yan. Very breaking out of the box, thinking out of the box, three pairs of relations. Very interesting how to achieve a balance among them, between them. Let's move on to our guest from the Philippines, Ms. Banloi, please. Your opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Lishin. Mabuhay from the Philippines. I would like to emphasize that confrontation is always counterproductive to regional peace and prosperity, and dialogue is the way ahead for the peaceful settlement of disputes in the South China Sea. And so I would like to discuss some pragmatic and legal options for the peaceful settlement of disputes in the South China Sea. The 1982 United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea provides many important provisions for coastal states to peacefully settle maritime disputes in order to promote cooperation and avoid violent conflicts at sea. When undertaking unilateral activities in disputed areas, UNCLOS obligates all states to take actions that entail cooperation, consultation, and most importantly, prior notification. And according to UNCLOS, there are at least three types of provisional arrangements in disputed areas. Number one is development cooperation arrangement. Number two, provisional boundary agreement. And three, mutual restraint arrangements. Development cooperation arrangements can be in the form of joint fishery management, common development of hydrocarbon resources, marine environmental research, marine environmental protection, and others. Development cooperation is the primordial goal of the 2002 China-ASEAN Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, and even the ongoing negotiation for the conclusion of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. Provisional boundary agreement, on the other hand, is viewed to be an alternative option to final maritime delimitation because, as said by Dr. Yan Yan, it will take really time to have this kind of final maritime delimitation agreement. But provisional boundary agreement aims to pursue cooperation or pragmatic cooperation to fulfill the mandate of UNCLOS for all parties to exercise their duty to cooperate, which the DOC and COC aim to achieve. Finally, a mutual restraint arrangement obligates parties to UNCLOS to mutually exercise self-restraint in the conduct of harmful and even offensive unilateral activities that hamper cooperation and even jeopardize the reaching of a final agreement. Coupled with obligation to exercise mutual restraint is the application of the principle of due regard, which requires states to respect the inherent rights and legitimate national positions of other states on maritime issues. We need mutual respect in settling our disputes in the South China Sea. Without self-restraint and due regard, it will be very difficult to promote development cooperation and even come out with a boundary agreement, whether in the final or provisionary forms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Van Laui. Thank you. We often forget the UNCLOS encourages certain conduct on top of prohibiting some others. Yeah, thank you for reminding us, and we will dive into that aspect during part 2 of the discussion. Last but not least, Ambassador Yi Xianliang, your turn, please.
Cooperation and governance need two pillars. One is mechanism, another one is the rule of law. Right now, most of the conflicts and disagreements arise from the semi-enclosed sea globally. While we talk about the ocean governance and cooperation, most problems and conflicts come from the enclosed sea and the semi-enclosed sea. So I would like to have some suggestions for our region, because right now, or nowadays, from Sea of Japan, Yellow Sea, East China Sea, South China Sea, we have no anybody of the coastal states to deal with the issues in a whole picture. First is about the bodies, I mean the mechanism, where we need to have some political decision on the high level. Perhaps we need the council of the heads of states or heads of the governments, and also the committee for the ministers. Then we have some resources committee to deal with fisheries and biodiversity. They said, perhaps we need some bodies for science and technology, for climate change, meteorology, and also we need some environment bodies for oil dig, for microplastic like this. So this is for the mechanism. And they said for the rules, right now we have no rules from the coastal states or between the coastal states. We have a lot of basis for such rules. Treaties, multilateral treaties, bilateral treaties, national laws and practice. So let's try our best in this regard. But what we need now is political determination. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. Settlement of maritime disputes, dialogue or confrontation. Welcome to part 2 of a special 2-part series with me, Liu Xin, on the point, coming to you from the beautiful seaside resort of Sanya in southern China's Hainan province. It's jointly organized by the Huayang Center for Maritime Cooperation and Ocean Governance, the China Oceanic Development Foundation, the National Institute for South China Sea Studies, Hainan Institute for Free Trade Port Studies, and CGTN. Our distinguished panelists are Wu Shicun, Chairman of the Huayang Research Center for Maritime Cooperation and Ocean Governance, and Chairman of the Academic Committee at the China National Institute for South China Sea Studies, Phillip Saunders, Dean Emeritus and Adjunct Professor of Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University in Canada, O.A. Sun, Principal Advisor at the Pacific Research Center of Malaysia, Navy Captain Suk-Joon Yoon, Senior Fellow at the Korea Institute for Military Affairs and a retired Republic of Korea Navy Captain, Yan Yan, Director of the Research Center for Oceans Law and Policy at the National Institute for South China Sea Studies, Romel Balawi, President of the Philippine Society for International Security Studies, and Ambassador Yi Xianliang, Visiting Professor at Chengdu University of Technology and former Ambassador of China to Norway. And we have guests here also who have been following us. Let's give ourselves a warm round of applause as we dive into the second part. So during the first part, each panelist have laid out their opening positions. I'm sure you all have something to say to each other, but we have 7 guests. Where do we start? Mr. Wu, why don't we start from you? Exactly what is the one biggest challenge in maintaining peace and stability in the South China Sea, having heard the last 7 guests?
How long
6
is
guests.
it?
How about 2 minutes?
Okay. Big challenges that we are facing in the South China Sea for the peace and stability.
One big challenge, the biggest.
Challenge, one big challenge, or 2 big challenges, okay, or 3. Number 1 is United States is no neutral for its South China Sea policy. The United States used to be neutral towards its South China Sea, but now it is not case. The second one is because the Columbia States would like take the window opportunity to consolidate and expand their vested interests by unilateral actions in dispute areas. Number 3 is the negative impact of the ruling. All of those activities, even FNOPs conducted by the United States, are based on the ruling, or in other words, was endorsed by the ruling. Thank you. Big challenges. 3.
Okay, so the United States, the ruling of 2016 and FNOPs. Professor Saunders, you would like to address that? I mean, as you just said, you have, Canada and the United States have a similar dispute, right, concerning territory. How come you don't have an arbitrary ruling given down to you that you are obliged to accept?
Well, actually, we did have a dispute that
Okay.
went to court. And
Okay.
an example for this, they would be the habits of trust and cooperation that takes time to build, particularly after litigation. But Canada and the U.S. did go to court, the International Court of Justice, over the boundary, the fishing boundary in particular, in the Gulf of Maine. It was a major political dispute on both sides. But the diplomats in that case had reached a solution, and they put it up, but it couldn't get ratified in the U.S. Senate, as the treaty had to be ratified because of opposition by fishing interests from Massachusetts. So what we did, actually, is they put a sort of a suicide pill in the agreement that if the treaty wasn't ratified, they'd go to court. So they did go to court, but it was done with trust and the agreement of both sides.
Yeah. Just now you mentioned the keyword advanced consent. Yes. Right. So in that case, both Canada and the United States had advanced consent.
In that case, they had actual consent because they had done so in the treaty. It didn't require the jurisdiction.
But in the case of the South China Sea ruling, what would...
The jurisdiction in the South China Sea ruling was obtained by the application of the compulsory dispute settlement procedures in the law of the sea treaty, which didn't exist when we went to court, and of course the United States is still not a party. But that is truly advanced consent, because you're consenting to some future arbitration panel deciding whether they have jurisdiction over your dispute, which can be quite risky.
Okay. Well, I guess you were still talking about the China-Canada case. Maybe I go to Ban Lao, our guest from the Philippines. Do you see a difference between the case between, just now Professor Saunders alluded to, and the case between China and the Philippines? Well, the case that Philippines brought to The Hague. Is there a difference in terms of advance consent?
Well, there is a stark difference because China rejected the whole process and even rejected the whole decision. But I would like to emphasize 3 exemplary cases where parties can really settle peacefully their disputes, and if they cannot settle peacefully their disputes, they can manage their disputes. Like, for example, between the Philippines and Indonesia, we had already a delimitation agreement of our overlapping exclusive economic zone in the Sulu and Celebes Sea, and it took us more than 20 years to negotiate for that. So we can settle disputes. And second, with Sabah, although the issue of Sabah keeps on going on every now and then, the Philippines and Malaysia have existing mechanism to manage their differences very well. Third, with Vietnam. You know, we are also having territorial disputes and maritime jurisdictional conflict with Vietnam. But we also have a mechanism to manage our differences with Vietnam. So the question is, if we can do that with Indonesia, if we can do that with Malaysia, if we can do that with Vietnam, why we can't do that with China? We cannot do that with China because of, Dr. Woo Sik-Joon told us, because there is an extra-regional factor, and that is the United States. Thank you.
I was wondering where you were going to point to, but your last question really gave the answer, I believe. Okay, Navy Captain Yoon, you were shaking your head. What were you not agreeing with?
Well, I'm not divert my Philippines colleagues' argument. Rather, I would like to express my personal perspective on South China Sea issues. There are 3 intractable obstacle factors for the cooperation. First, third-party involvement. South Korea has restricted express with regarding to South China Sea issues because we are not part of the South China Sea issues. But since 2023, after the summit between United States and South Korea, we begin to express our concern for the South China Sea issues under the United States Biden administration's heavy pressures. Second, we should not militarize the South China Sea issues. Actually, serving more than 34 years in our Navy, I never heard what is the freedom of navigation operation. It appears to be just inert navigation from one place to other place. But United States say we conducted freedom of navigation in order to make illegal Chinese excessive maritime territorial claim. This is not the right way to do so for the dialogue and cooperation. Third, there are huge disinformation with regarding to Chinese activity, a more aggressive, active, pre-active activity on a South China Sea issue, such as Maritime Malaysia. I did participate our domestic conference in South Korea a couple of weeks ago. We have a big argument. But what is the major role of Maritime Malaysia? They have make some more aggressive and physical act against parties, third parties. No, they just present over there. So my argument is we should carefully deal with some Western media report regarding to South China Sea issues in a daily basis. I'd better stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Ambassador, you wanted to chip in here.
Thank you. I would like to have 3 points to comments or get some clarification about our previous speaks. First is about China and Philippines relations, close relations on South China Sea. You say China and the Philippines had almost 20 years consultation or dialogue. Actually, this is not true. I used to be the Deputy Director General and the Director General of the Department for the Boundary and Ocean Affairs. So I request my counterpart in Manila to have visited, talk about our relations on South China Sea. Unfortunately, just one time, because I declare in Sanya, I did never get any invitation from Philippines. So at that moment, your former president, Ramos, ordered Philippine foreign minister to invite me to pay the visit. And also we invite Philippines side to come to Beijing or any parts of China to exchange views, but we failed. Suddenly, you initiate, the cause to The Hague. I worked in The Hague for 8 years as a legal advisor for the ambassador and also for the embassy. So now, what happened? So I would like to have some clarification with you. The second is from Captain Yoon. 2 points. The first about the military neutrality. As you know, Right now, we have 151 coastal states in the world. Most of them belong to the semi-enclosed or enclosed sea. Half of them, their enforcement, legal enforcement rely on the Navy, particularly the developing countries. So if you suggest the military neutrality in the legal enforcement, it needs some basis, needs some practice globally. The second, you talk about neutrality on the disputes. I would like to check with you, how about the Korean Navy kept a neutral position on the disputes between Korea and Japan on the Lin-Court locks in the past 2 decades. The third point is about the performance.
Hold your horse, please, Ambassador.
Uh-huh.
Hold your horse.
Yes.
Shall we give the other 2 guests some time, an opportunity to react if they choose to? Mr. Ban Loy, you would like to say something?
Okay.
The unwillingness or the lack of initiative from the Philippine governmental side for the olive branches from the Chinese side.
Yeah, based on that statement, I would like to stress that it takes strong leadership decision to really come out with cooperative arrangement. Like, for example, during the time of former President Rodrigo Duterte, he initiated a strong will to really deal with China and cooperate with China, and we made a breakthrough in 2019. We already decided to establish several working groups for cooperation to occur, like joint fishery management, cooperation in the area of search and rescue operation, and even Coast Guard to Coast Guard cooperation. And the biggest project that they entered into was a memorandum of understanding for the development of natural gas and oil. In other words, yeah, we can cooperate. But of course, there are external interferences and also domestic pressure against that, because you know the nature of our politics in the Philippines. If in China, the government policy is defined and influenced by the Communist Party of China, in the Philippines, our government policy is greatly shaped by the vested interests of our oligarchy. And our ruling oligarchy has a pro-American orientation, and therefore they're opposed to that kind of arrangement. Because if the Philippines cooperate with China, that's a win for China. That's a win for China, and therefore a defeat for the United States and its like-minded allies in the region. But we can cooperate, and that is why I am emphasizing that we have to go back to the achievements of that agreement, that we can cooperate if there is a strong will on the part of the leadership to really cooperate.
Okay. I hope the Filipino leadership will hear this conversation and get your message. And Navy Captain Yoon, please, would you like to react?
Yes, 2 points. Actually, I had the questions from the excellencies. The first one, yes, militarization in to resolve the maritime boundary issues, especially in the semi-crossed seas. I think that is why South Korea have enhanced our law enforcement capabilities rather than to invest our money onto our naval force, which is we would like to input our naval force in disputed lines, probably, or boundaries. So that is, I think, the way to do so to avoid any militarized over issues. Second, in doctor issues, we want to be state quo with regarding to undisputable dispute with Japan. Am I right? Correct? Yeah, for the second question, Tokyo issues.
My question for you is about your disputes between you and Japan. The Korean Navy kept neutral position on these disputes in the past 2 decades. If we check with the history, what happened on these islands and what happened between Korea and Japan? Because you suggested neutrality for the military actions, for the enforcement or for any disputes of the oceanic matters, right?
I think we have a clear policy to deal with the dispute issues our neighboring countries, mostly coastal countries, because Japan is not declared the archipelago state countries. We regard them to still coastal countries. But the problem is, on-scene commanders have a heavy duty or responsibilities to complete his missions as constabulary missions in the naval functions. I think that is the major way to do so, and then that is the major reason I brought on my topics. Military neutrality is much important. I've been to Navy, served more than 80 years for the sea duties as a Droven 40 for my basis as commanding office. But every time, under the direction from Supreme Command, all responsibilities lie on to my own self. So I got to be more militarized action to deal with the issues in the disputed waters. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Yan, you would like to chip in here because you were talking about inclusive exclusiveness. It seems that exclusivity is the zeitgeist, is it?
Well, this is exactly what I've been talking about, the control of the waters and to compete for jurisdiction over the ocean and in human history. And also what I summarized from the previous discussion between these two speakers is that the key word is political will. With the political will, you can choose either to dealterate the dispute or bilateral relations, or you can choose to enhance maritime cooperation. It's all about political will between China and the Philippines.
Is there an equal amount of political will? Or I understand, as a Chinese, I understand there is a great will from the part of China to respect navigation in accordance with international, to settle disputes peacefully. Is that will shared? If not, why by regional country from your observation, Ian?
Maybe just one point. I think it's pretty clear to us that the political will of President Duterte and President Bongbong Marcos is different. It's like very large difference between two of them. And also, not just the way he treats the dispute between China and the Philippines, but also he treats the dispute between the Philippines and also Malaysia. Like, for example, correct me if I'm wrong, the newly released Maritime Zone Act by the Philippines, well, they also included the Sabah Maritime Zones or disputed with Malaysia into its EEZ, and does receive a protest from Malaysia as well. So this is, well, correct me if I'm wrong. So I think this is what the current president of the Philippines way of dealing the dispute.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Mr. O, you were talking about Asian wisdom, our way of dealing with this. Try to jump out of this, right? The nitty-gritty details. What really is the way to dialogue, not to confrontation? Keep it short, please.
Well, number one, like when Malaysia was protesting about Philippines' enactment of the law, which somehow sort of swept in Sabah, right? Well, at the same time, Philippines was hit by some sort of typhoons, and well, we still send our military assets to assist in the rescue efforts and so on. So that shows you within all these Southeast Asian countries, we could disagree or sometimes agree to disagree, but we still help one another. But I'm also very intrigued by the suggestions of provisional arrangement by Romeo, as well as political will by Ms. Yan. I think we sometimes have to think out of the box. For example, in South China Seas, we could think of, indeed, we have been talking about joint exploitation, joint exploration for quite some time. I think we should put our words to deeds. We should really do it, and perhaps all of us will set up some sort of fund. If we cannot set up such a fund, then we use the Belt and Road initiatives, right? Because all this needs money. When you have a fund, you have money, and you use to sort of use the money to develop some of these littoral countries. I think everybody would feel the benefit, everybody will be thankful, and then the sort of political will, the sort of confidence building mechanism and so on would be set in place. Then you can enter into dialogues, negotiations, and so on, which I mentioned just now here.
Professor Saunders, I'll leave the last remark to Mr. Wu. I'm sure you have a lot of things to say, but Professor Saunders, Mr. O just gave very idealistic prospects for the future, very good solutions, how applicable, and what is the crust of the problem we're looking at, and going forward to the next 4 years, you know?
The possibilities. The next 4 years, I think we're all a little in the dark with the American view. But what I would like to point out is that the types of disputes you're describing and the ones where there is hope for cooperation is a set of disputes among neighbors. The country next door isn't going away. Whereas if you think of the maritime disputes through the 1970s and 80s that Canada, the South Pacific Islands in particular, and others were dealing with, it was distant water fishing and other predatory activities by countries that had no stake in the region at all, no permanent stake. And what was necessary with them, like Spain at one point, although Spain improved remarkably, what was necessary was enforcement, and pretty strict enforcement.
May I just take this opportunity, because there's a lot of press. If you read the press, China is not respecting international law because of the UNCLOS, because of the arbitral tribunal. It's like black and white. You were talking about ambitious tribunal. Can you expand a little bit on that? 2 sentences, please.
I think there's a broader question beyond the South China Sea about tribunals that take a single dispute that's been brought to them, possibly under difficult jurisdictional settings, and try to make rules for the international community. Not very well. The difficulty in international law is if you look at the statements of the United Kingdom and the United States after the arbitration, they both were phrased very carefully that we endorse this decision and that we think that both parties should recognize that it is binding upon them. Because it's not binding on the United States, who has island territories throughout the Pacific that exceed the limits, and it is not binding apparently on the United Kingdom, which has drawn baselines around the Falkland Islands. So there's a bit of hypocrisy in these claims about that particular decision, which many states would not consider to be binding on them anyway.
Go into the details. And Mr. Wu.
Okay, thank you. I would talk a little bit more about the South China Sea arbitration ruling, because I guess if we open the floor for discussion, there might be a lot of concerns about the arbitration award. I went to Shalom Bay, Vietnam, to attend this year's 16th International South China Sea Conference. Ambassador Deng and Dr. Ran Xiongsan is here. I was questioned by lots of participants why China didn't participate in the arbitration process, why China doesn't recognize the arbitration ruling. So I would simply to answer this question in this occasion, because the dispute, the problem between China and the Philippines is not about the application, interpretation of UNCLOS. It is about the stubborn disputes. The fact was that the Philippines, since the 1970s, by military actions, occupied illegally 8 South China Sea islands or reefs. So the substantive issue is territorial dispute. It goes beyond UNCLOS. So that's why China didn't participate, and once the arbitration tribunal issued its ruling, didn't recognize the ruling. And another important principle is Philip, my friend, mentioned state consent. Because the state consent is a necessary prerequisite to any form of dispute settlement. So that's the main reason why China didn't participate and didn't recognize the ruling. Thank you.
We're almost on time. Thank you so much. A warm round of applause to my guests, Mr. Wu Shicun, Professor Phillip Saunders, Mr. O.A. Sung, Captain Yu, Ms. Yan Yan, Mr. Romel Ban Laui, and Ambassador Yi Xianliang. And with that, we come to the end of part 2 of this very special 2-part series on maritime cooperation and dispute settlement. It has been brought to you by the Huayang Center for Maritime Cooperation and Ocean Governance, the China Oceanic Development Foundation, the National Institute for South China Sea Studies, Hainan Institute for Free Trade Port Studies, and CGTN. I'm Liu Xin, coming to you from Sanya. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing, this time in Sanya. But I'll go back to Beijing, and on behalf of the whole team, thank you so much for watching, and you've got the point.